everyone. How are you? I am exhausted. I just got back after a long couple of days. I stayed away because of the work we were doing on some of our solar work wasn't completed yet. So I had to stay right where I was, and I found this funky hotel. We normally stay at another place in the area. It's about a 45-minute drive, but it was full. We couldn't, book it ahead of time, and stayed the night in a place that was a little scary. Wasn't sure if I was going to get bed bugs or not. And just the water, I went to take a shower and the water had shut off. And so I had no shower, and I didn't even have the change of clothes with me because we just kind of decided to go do it. And the rooms were really close together, and they don't have good uh, ceiling windows, and so there's windows actually in the hallway between the rooms, and the noise from everything kept me awake. And someone was watching a TV across the way, and it was loud, and didn't sleep real well. Then we went up and did all the work, and I got sunburned out in the sun today working on the hydro panels, and just kind of burned myself out today. So anyway, I made it home so I could record this for you, and I hope that it blesses you and you're excited about what you're going to learn today. We're going to be looking at the vine, the branches, and the husbandman. And we're actually going to not be looking at First John because we're going to First John in this idea of the vine and branches, but I want to go back to John's Gospel in chapter 15 because John is the author of both books. Chapters 1 through the first part of 13 are a different section. Chapters 13 through 16 are another section, even into kind of part of 17, and then 18 and so on is a little different. We'll talk about that specifically as we look at the upper room discourse, which is chapters 13 through 16. That's where Jesus had excuse me where Jesus had his conversation with his disciples before his crucifixion. And part of the upper room discourse is this passage here at the middle of it, between 13 through 16, almost the middle, where he is talking about the vine and branches. They had just had their communion together, their Passover meal together. Jesus mentioned all the reasons to do it. Now was no longer to remember the Passover from Israel, but now we're moving on and do it in remembrance of him. His body would be the one broken rather than a lamb, and his blood shed rather than the blood of the sacrificed animal, because he would be the sacrificed one. And so he says, do this in remembrance of me. And they had Passover, they had their meal, and they sang a hymn. They went out, and on the way to the garden where Jesus was betrayed is believed to be this vineyard, and the description that Jesus gave when he spoke to the disciples on the way. So here we are in chapter 15. If you want to turn there, John 15. I also have it on the screen if you can see it. I want you to be able to follow along in your own Bible. If you can, take notes, but let's follow this along. Chapter 15, verses 1 through 8. Verse 1 says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. The I am here is, of course, Jesus, and the Father, which is God the Father, is the vine dresser. The husbandman is another word that is used. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, he prunes it so that it may bear more fruit. We had quite a discussion with our pastors here in Nicaragua about this vine and branches. They brought it up. I didn't, because we're talking about the difference between relationship and fellowship, between salvation and discipleship. This passage is all about discipleship. There's nothing in here about heaven or hell or, trusting in Jesus or being saved. This has everything to do with a believer's participation in fellowship, spiritual growth, honoring God, and bearing fruit. So we'll get to that as we go further, but I want you to see that as we read this. So verse 2 again, every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, he prunes it so that it may bear more fruit. Verses 3 and 4. You are already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, so neither can you unless you abide in me. It's kind of strange that he says you are already clean right here. But going back to verse 2, he's talking about the pruning process for believers. So here he's giving the example that you're already clean. You are part of me. You've been washed. Now I want you to understand that verse 4, have fellowship with me, and I will have fellowship with you. Okay, so let's move on to verse 5. He says, I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me, and I in him, he bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away as a branch and dries up. And they gather them and cast them in the fire, and they are burned. Verse 6 is the confusing question for many people, because isn't that hell? Aren't we talking about the lake of fire? And if you don't obey, you get taken away and thrown into the fire. Well, we'll talk about that. The word abide, you're going to see that a lot in this chapters 13 through 16, and you're going to see it really strong in 1 John if you haven't noticed that already. The word abide tells us that we're dealing with fellowship truth. Remember we talked about A truth and B truth. B truth would be fellowship truth. So this is B truth. Here is a Christian not abiding in Christ, not having fellowship with Christ, not remaining, not having the intimacy with the Father, with the Son, with Christ. So let's look at verse 7. If you abide in me, if you have fellowship with me, if you remain in me, it says, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. The proof here is not to be that you're his children, but that you're his followers, his disciples. Okay? And that glorifies God even more, that you're bearing not just fruit, but much fruit. And God is glorified in that. And of course, we want to glorify God as our main purpose. So let's review some of these things we've been talking about over the past couple of months. When one becomes a Christian, the Holy Spirit comes to live inside of him. Now, according to Christ and his message, this resident ministry is permanent. He says in chapter 14, I will pray to the Father, and he will give you another comforter, that he may abide with you for how long? Forever. Even the Spirit of truth, he dwells with you and shall be or will be in you. Okay, at this point, he hadn't come yet. He's saying, I am promising you that I will ask the Father and you will have the Spirit. But he hadn't come. We found out in our Acts study, in our church services, that he came at Pentecost and indwelt into them permanently, never left, because we are sealed with the Holy Spirit now. Okay, he doesn't come and go. It might feel like it, but that's because of our behavior, not his. Go back to chapter 15 of John and verse 1. says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser, as I mentioned earlier, the husbandman. There's a lot in this verse. The vine dresser is the gardener, someone who takes care of the plants. The I am, he says, is the last of those I ams that Jesus presents in the Gospel of John. If you remember, he said things like, I am the door, I am the way, I am the living water, I am the bread of life. And he always refers to these as the true or real of all these. So we understand now he's I'm the true vine. So Jesus is the true vine, but this is where we get to learn something. This is where Israel once was the true vine. Now Jesus has become the true vine. You see, Jehovah God took care of Israel like God takes care of the church. Now Israel was the vine, but the vine only turned up sour grapes. If you read starting in the story in Exodus, where God starts to send Israel away from Egypt and out of the hands of Pharaoh and his army, they're finally able to get away. God protects them in a fiery cloud by night and a whirlwind cloud during the day. He uses that cloud to separate Israel from Egypt's army when they gather their senses and try to come after Israel. Israel's trapped between that army and the Red Sea. God opens the Red Sea and provides a way for them to walk across on dry land. After they cross on dry land, God shuts the water back to where it was running again as a sea. But in the process, Egypt's army had started to gather across, and when they came across, God caused it to become muddy again and the wheels to fall off the chariots. And scripture says the horse and the rider were cast into the sea and they drowned. So God provided protection for them. All they had to do was go and walk and be where God wanted them to be. God took care of them. So here again, God looked out for the vine. That's Israel. But it only turned up sour grapes. They were sour grapes before they passed the sea. They got trapped and said, Lord, or Moses, did you just bring us out here to die? Why did God do this? We were at least able to eat and live and work, but no, we're here, we're going to die out here. They're going to come and kill us, or we're going to drown in the sea. They complained. God provided a way out. And then after they rejoice on the other side and start their journey, they get into Mount Sinai, and Moses goes up on the mountain and begins to have a conversation with God, and God produces for him the 10 Commandments written with his own finger. Came down and sees the children of Israel complaining that they haven't seen Aaron, that God is no longer with them, and they make a golden calf to worship. And out of all of their gold and silver, which, by the way, was given to them by God through the Egyptians when they left Egypt, so none of it was their own. And they used it and turned it into a false god and worship system. As they traveled and journeyed, they continued to complain and murmur against Moses, against Aaron, against God, all these kinds of complaining, but they always came up again as sour grapes. So, as the true vine, he now has new branches, okay? Branches that he wants to not produce sour grapes, but to produce abundant, good fruit. Okay, look at Psalm chapter 80 and verse 8. David is re-quoting or recounting what God did back in Exodus. He says, you removed a vine from Egypt. That vine again was Israel. You drove out the nations and planted it. So God says, leave Egypt. I'm going to go send you into the land that you will go to, a land flowing with milk and honey. I will drive out all the nations before you, and it will be your land. So David recounted, you removed a vine from Egypt, and you drove out the nations, and basically replanted it in the land of Canaan. Go also to the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 21. He says, "Yet I planted you a choice vine." This is God speaking. "A completely faithful seed. How then have you turned yourself before me into the degenerate shoots of a foreign vine?" So God planted them. They were to be a completely faithful seed, and they turned around and began to be like the other nations, which God said that they would do if they didn't utterly destroy them, and they didn't utterly destroy them. Prophet Isaiah says in chapter 5, verses 1 through 7, "Let me sing now for my well-beloved, a song of my beloved concerning his vineyard. My well-beloved had a vineyard on a fertile hill," and that fertile hill would have been the land of Canaan. Verse 2, "He dug around it, removed its stones, planted it with the choicest vine, and he built a tower in the middle of it, and he hewed out a wine vat in it. Then he expected it to produce good grapes, but it produced only worthless ones." Now, there is the idea that they produced, but there's no good production. Verse 3, "And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard." Verse 4, "What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have done in it? Why, when I expected it to produce good grapes, did it produce worthless ones?" Again, there's some production there, but it's not good, it's worthless. Verse 5, "Now let me tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it will be consumed. I will break down its wall, and it will become trampled ground." Now, this is prophetic at the time about Israel and their land. The Babylonians were going to come in, and they were going to remove Israel, take them to their land, and they would go into Israel's land and tear it down, trample it, even salt it eventually so that it could not produce anything from the soil. But it says it would be consumed. Now, it doesn't mean hell. Just like that verse says in John, those will be taken off and burned. Here, they're removed from their land and consumed by the other nations and consumed by the army of Babylon and taken into captivity. So they lost their land privilege at the time. God still owned it, but he gave it to the Babylonians at the time to let it rest as God wanted it to do, and for Israel to wake up and smell the coffee. Verse 6, he says, "I will lay it waste. It will not be pruned or hoed, but briars and thorns will come up. I will also charge the clouds to bring no rain on it." That very fruitful land no longer was able to produce. Verse 7, "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his delightful plant." See, we understand what these are now. What is the vineyard? The house of Israel. What's the plant? Judah, the men of Judah. So Israel and Judah had been parted at this time, had been separated and divided, but God is bringing them all into one package here by saying, they are my plant, they're my vineyard. So thus he looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold, a cry of distress. So back to John 15, verse 1. Now that had been accomplished, Jesus said, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser," the husbandman. Okay, so now instead of Israel's vineyard being talked about, Jesus has taken that place as the vine. He longed for fruit, but the vine, that's Israel, became degenerate and produced rotten fruit. That's a quote from John Walvoord and Roy Zuck in the Bible Knowledge Commentary. So again, he longed for fruit. God longed for fruit, but the vine, Israel, became degenerate and produced rotten fruit. Jesus says again, I'm the vine, the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Walvoord and Zuck go on to say, therefore Jesus, as the true vine, fulfills what God had intended for Israel. And now, through the church, the vine and branches begin to produce, but not bad fruit. It's either fruit or no fruit. Also, they go on to say, the Father is the gardener who cultivates and protects the vine. Okay, God does that. God takes care of it. God nourishes it. God makes sure that everything is working with it to make it produce. Okay, to help it produce. In verse 2, he says, but every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, he prunes it so that it may bear more fruit. Here we have he, that's the gardener, the Father, desires fruit. That's mentioned 8 times in this chapter. In verse 2, it's mentioned 3 times. In verse 4, it's mentioned twice, and in 5 and verse 8, and even verse 16, which we didn't read. So we see that this fruit is something that God desires to have happen. That's why he spends so much time on the vine and the branches. Let's continue. A progression is seen, that is, fruit in verse 2, and in 2 it also says more fruit. And you get into verses 5 and 8, it says much fruit. Remember, it says, my Father is glorified in this. And we want to be bearing much fruit. We want to be producing fruit and much fruit. That's important for God's glory. And then verse 2, every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. Okay, let's talk about this. Here is part of the metaphor of the vine and seems to mean every person who professes to be my disciple, that is, a branch, is not necessarily a true disciple or a true follower. Just because you say you are doesn't mean that you are. And the proof of that discipleship is that you bear fruit. It's not proof that you are a child of God, that you are part of the family. It's just whether or not you are a follower. And then he says, every year in Palestine, gardeners prune their vines. They cut off the dead wood that has no life and trim the living branches to increase their yield. One way we can understand this is that we can see that God allows people to go ahead and live their own life. You're my child, but you have the freedom to do what you would like to do. You're not going to bear fruit, then I'm not going to, spend the time, allow you to spend the time sucking resources out of me for nothing. And so you're going to go live your own life. You're my child. Do as you will, but I'm going to produce more fruit. And if it's not going to be through you, it's going to be through someone else. And the problem with this is that many people don't realize that once you're no longer able to produce fruit and no longer attached to the vine in fellowship, you never will produce fruit. So it's why he says you need to abide, you need to remain so that you can produce much fruit. Now, verse 3, he said, you are already clean because of the word which I had spoken to you. Now, if we go back to chapter 13, I won't have it on my slides, but if you want to go back to chapter 13, verses 10 and 11, you will see that when the disciples are at the room, Jesus takes off his robe and starts to wash the disciples' feet because they hadn't done that. None of them had prepared that, even though they were in charge of that. So Jesus begins to wash their feet, and Jesus gets to Peter, and Peter, of course, has to talk. says, "Oh Lord, don't wash my feet. You'll never wash my feet." And Jesus says, you know, if I don't wash your feet, then you will have no part in me. Well, wait a minute. Here we're talking about abiding, not salvation. Okay? You won't have a part, an abiding part in me. So then Peter, of course, opens his mouth and says, "Oh, well, then wash my head and my hands, my whole body, wash everything." And Jesus obviously had little patience with him, said, "No, those of you who have already taken a bath are already clean. Only you need to wash the grime off your feet, the daily grime." Okay, so you're saved, but you're going to have some sin that continues to cling to you and have trouble in your daily life. Things that you go about doing in life, whether you know about them or you don't know about them, those sins are going to affect you. And so I want to make sure you're totally clean. You know, the disciples had been cleaned by Jesus and his message, but one, that's Judas, he had not been purified. In fact, we know one reason is that Judas was taken out of the room. In other words, God leaned into him and said, "Hey, what you must do quickly, take care of it." And Judas got up and left, and then he had this fellowship with his disciples that Judas didn't get to have. So we understand that Jesus is saying, you are already clean because of the word which I spoke to you. You're already my children and you've been forgiven, but you've got a couple little sin issues you need to deal with, confessing sin. 1 John 1:9. If we confess our sin, he's faithful and just to forgive our sin and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. These guys maybe took a bath before they came to Passover, which certainly was part of the plan, as back in the book of both Exodus and Leviticus talked about, but Exodus is the first discussion of the Passover. And Jesus said, wash yourselves, bathe yourselves, purify yourselves, and then take your lamb, sacrifice it, and put the blood over the door. So they were clean. But the problem is, moving from place to place, they got dirt on their feet. They had dirt roads, and they had animals up and down the roads, and they had all kinds of stuff. And here in Nicaragua, people will just spit anywhere they want. You stand by the road, stand by your car, spit, snort, all these kinds of stuff. And so people back then would just kind of walk in this stuff, and so their feet would get dirty quickly. And so that's why they had the upper room cleaning of the feet, as God was purifying wholly the person. And so it's what he says here then. Now, verse 4, abide in me, remain in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, so neither can you unless you abide in me. So it went from a branch as an illustration to help understand the meaning of unless you abide in me. If we do not abide, if we are not in fellowship, if we are not remaining and attempting to produce fruit, we can't remain. We won't remain. Okay? You cannot produce fruit. Fruitfulness, as it says here, is the result of the Son's life being reproduced in a disciple. The result of the Son of God being reproduced in a disciple. One of the main goals that God has for us, I'll say it again, is that we are conformed to the image of his Son. And this is part of that conforming. Fruitfulness is the result of the Son's life being reproduced in a disciple. The disciple's part is to abide. So again, if you are not abiding, you can't produce fruit. Therefore, you will not be reproducing the life of the Son in your life. Bearing fruit is not a metaphor for going to heaven or having eternal life. It's about intimacy, spiritual growth, discipleship, and fellowship, and being molded, shaped, and conformed into the image of his Son. And remember, when you prune something, you kind of see that molding and shaping for that conformity. Without the life of God, no real fruit can be produced. Israel tried to have life without God. And while they produced some fruit, it was not real fruit. It was bad fruit. And it was worthless. Without the life of God, no fruit can be produced, much less much fruit. When I was a little boy, my parents had an orange tree, and it would grow these fantastic green leaves, dark green. And then when they would bloom, the flower and the orange would grow. The orange was huge. I mean, it was a big orange, and it looked amazing. And one day I took one of these oranges and I opened it up and I took a bite, and oh, it was nasty. It looked so good. It was gross. And so I asked my dad about it. I'm like, Dad, that orange was disgusting. What's the matter with it? Because I tried another one. I thought, well, maybe this one is just bad. I tried another one. Same thing. Blah. It was terrible. My dad says, well, because it's called a decorative orange tree. It's just for looks. It doesn't produce good fruit. It produces fruit, but that fruit is worthless. It's only good to throw at people and make a mess, which, we did. We had fun with them that way, but they would fall to the ground and they would rot because nobody would eat them, and then the smell from the rotten fruit. It's a really good picture of Israel. It's a good picture of Christians who are abiding but not producing, who are worthless in their fruit making. And we'll talk more about the consequences of this, not only being cut away, but what consequences are both physical and eternal in this life. When we talk more then in 1 John, as we get into chapter 3, hopefully next week if we get everything coordinated, and then we will be addressing this issue. So don't worry, we'll explain more. I know you have a lot of questions because there can be some confusing things here, but I want you to understand that Jesus became that true vine that filled in for Israel. He is an Israelite in the sense he's a Jew. He was born of the tribe of Judah, but he ultimately fulfilled that purpose of becoming that true vine. But he still wants to produce fruit and be a reproducing of himself in us. And so that's why he prunes us. And that pruning process might not be comfortable. It might not feel good. And again, we'll talk about that more in the future. But for now, I'm going to take some rest. I'm exhausted, about lost my voice again. I know it's kind of a short lesson, but it'll give you something to think about, to talk about. Maybe do some of your own research, but spend time fellowshipping together. And I will be back with you this coming Friday. Tomorrow, I'll be up there in the afternoon. And then we'll have our men's breakfast, and look forward to seeing the guys again and being a part of that. So thanks for watching and being a part, and for intently learning and listening. And we'll answer some of these questions and clarify it more as we get into the book of 1 John. So thanks so much. Miss you guys. Love you guys. Praying for you as I'm away. And I hope you're all doing well. God bless you. And I will see you soon. Bye-bye.